I don't know, but I do know this. Once you've had hallucinations that convincing, that persuasive, that powerful, you never fully trust your perception ever again. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome once again to Bat Country. A lot of us are surprised by how extreme alcohol withdrawal can be. We, the general public at large, have a kind of general understanding, a vague sense that opioid and heroin withdrawal is very, very deeply unpleasant. But in our collective minds, in our cultural understanding, they're hard to withdraw from because they're narcotics and therefore illegal. Alcohol is not. You can basically buy alcohol in every convenience store and supermarket in the Western world. Fuck, you can even buy it from a gas station at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, as I can attest to. So it must be safe, right? We don't seem to know, though, that alcohol withdrawal can induce incredibly potent, vivid, realistic, and terrifying hallucinations as part of the withdrawal from it. I use the word realistic here as part of the framework of a delusion. So realistic is relative. Perhaps a better word here would be convincing. Very few of us seem to discuss the fact that withdrawing from alcohol can induce incredibly convincing hallucinations. If you want to skip straight ahead to that part, to the part where I discuss the actual hallucinations that I experienced, the fun bit, then please check the chapters below, go ahead and skip. I won't judge you, that's what I would be here for too. But I've never really discussed this stuff in detail, and I feel like I should. Not only because I think it's an objectively fascinating subject, and the experiences that I had are objectively interesting, I also think that it might be of use to somebody somewhere. It would be good for people to know that they can experience these things and kind of come out okay. Kind of. First though, to those remaining who haven't already skipped ahead to the fun bits later on, I think it's useful to provide some background so that you can interpret my experience within some kind of reasonable framework. What I'm about to tell you is incredibly personal, very private, quite scary, quite dark, and very honest in places. And this has taken me a long time to commit to video because it is so intrinsically personal to me. I'm going to go to some places that discuss some deep-seated insecurities that only me and my therapist really know about. I'm going to share that all because a lot of us who go through this, we don't seek help immediately, in general. Most of us, when we finally make the decision to put down the bottle, assume we can just do it. Assume that we can just stop. After all, not doing a thing is easier than doing a thing, surely. Not drinking must be easier than drinking, so we just assume that we can do it. It's not always like that. The majority of us, when we put down that bottle, we turn to the internet to help, rather than to some professional network or to experienced people. We turn to podcasts and Wikipedia and WebMD and we look there for information. But it's been my experience that there is shockingly little information about what it's actually like to go through something like alcoholic hallucinosis or delirium tremens or acute alcohol withdrawal syndrome, any of the other names in this network, this complex of withdrawal symptoms and experiences. There's very little literature about what it's actually like. One of my personal frustrations with this process of trying to get sober is the lack of specific information about the very earliest stages of sobriety, the first couple of weeks, the withdrawal process, the detox process. There's a lot of information saying that those are phases through which you have to go to get sober, but very little first-hand accounts of what they're actually like. That frustration is compounded by the unwillingness of medical professionals to commit to specific advice and information. And now that's understandable. They're not being deliberately evasive, and it's not like they don't have the answers. The truth is we're all biochemically different, and everybody's withdrawal is unique to them. Their withdrawal timeline is specific and personal. Everybody is different. Therefore, every diagnosis is different. And quitting's a confusing time. It's very difficult, and there are no hard and fast answers about how your body is going to respond, how you're going to hold up psychologically to the impulses and pressures of a difficult withdrawal. So you may as well know what you're about to get yourself into. The process of withdrawal is even harder if you have a pre-existing psychiatric condition, a major depressive disorder, or bipolarism, or I don't know, schizophrenia, which I don't have, or a traumatic brain injury, which I do have. Because it's very hard to discern what is a symptom of an underlying condition, like major depressive disorder, and what is a symptom of the withdrawal itself. All those lines are blurred and indistinct, and as such, the diagnoses tend to be indistinct too. Very clearly, I'm not a medical professional or any kind of recovery expert or an addiction counsellor or anything like that. But I do have extensive first-hand experience of both hallucinations without knowing they're hallucinations and hallucinations knowing they're hallucinations. I've got it all. So let's go. Let me hit you with a very scary statistic. Only 3% of people with an alcohol use disorder will experience delirium tremens as part of their withdrawal. And of that 3%, something like 40% will die. I've experienced delirium tremens 5 times, several close calls. Oh, fuck, I need a drink. I meant Coca-Cola. Calm down, I'm fine. It doesn't take much for me anymore. I can expect a 5-day drinking binge to be enough to trigger delirium tremens in me. So, some context and some background. Here we go. So, in 2018, about 5 years ago, I was cycling alone from Shanghai, where I'd been living for about 5 years, back to Europe, where there was a job waiting for me in Zagreb, Croatia. I was raising money for a domestic abuse charity in the UK, but also just because I really wanted to do it. It didn't end very well. There was jail, guns, drugs, sex, violence. In fact, I wrote a book about it. Check the description for a link. But in the course of preparing for that journey, I crashed my bike and suffered a fractured skull and a minor traumatic brain injury, a frontal lobe contusion, and I wouldn't know that I'd suffered that until many, many months, years later. And to this day, I'm not exactly sure how much that brain injury has contributed to everything that followed, contributed to everything I'm about to describe. It's impossible to get a clear answer on that, and I have asked repeatedly. What matters, though, for the sake of this story, is that as that journey progressed across central China, Xinjiang, the Taklamakan Desert, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and so on, I was leaning more and more on alcohol. The further I went, the more I drank. And I had no awareness whatsoever that I was carrying a head injury that had potential implications on impulse control, mood, and behaviour. I didn't know. After the journey ended, I was kept on a retainer by my employer and required to do very, very little work to fulfill that salary, and it was a healthy salary. So I rented a fishing cottage in a picturesque village in Cornwall and lived out the dream of every writer of Irish heritage. I wrote a book, drunk, for 5 months. By the final 2 months of that 5-month period, I was drinking at least 750 millimeters of vodka or whiskey a day. That's a fifth of vodka for my American friends out there. But that was the minimum. Usually it would be 2 of those, and perhaps more. And that went on every day with no break for weeks, that entire 5-month period. Morning to evening, drinking and writing. And then at some point, the book was finished, I thought, and it was time for me to sober up and restart my life. And that's when the first withdrawal happened. And with it, the first hallucinations. Let me describe what it was like the first time. About 3 days after I finished that last bottle of whiskey and told myself that was it, no more, I began to hear whispering outside my bedroom window. I was lying on my bed watching a lecture about archaeology on YouTube or something like that. I don't really remember what it was, but I could hear whispering over the video. I couldn't make it out, it was indistinct, and I was clicking through all of my open browser tabs to see if one of them was playing a video in the background or something. I checked my phone to see if it was on silent, whether it was playing some media. I looked under my bed to see if there were some Bluetooth headphones. It was that kind of noise, very, very, very distant, very, very quiet. It was indistinct at first, just the sound of whispering, literally just. But quite quickly, I started hearing my name among the whispers, as if whoever was whispering about me. As that went on, which it did for a long time, I think, the whispering became more insistent, more coherent. Some of the voices I would hear would occasionally be familiar. Some of them sounded like my mum calling my name with distress or fear in her voice. It was very disturbing. Eventually the whispering manifested as whole sentences in which various voices were discussing something terrible I'd done in my past, like some sexual misadventure or someone whose feelings I'd hurt. The voices were whispering about that event. The tone of their voices was full of scorn and disgust, disappointment, judgmental about me. They talked about painful memories, really hurtful shit, stupid things I'd said or bad sexual experiences, times I'd broken people's hearts or let them down, things that only I could possibly know about. And the fact that only I could have known the things that they were talking about should have been a clue that none of it was real, that it was in my mind. But the hallucinations have an incredibly powerful way of concealing themselves from you, of tricking you into thinking that they're real. They're so deceptive. These hallucinations are so clever that during a later hallucination, another period of withdrawal after this one, I discovered in conversation with my dad and with a doctor that the word hallucination itself had removed itself from my vocabulary. The hallucination is so insidious that it removed my ability to talk about it. Over time, the whispering evolved into something else, and then I had the sense that I was not alone in the room. I had a constant sense of presence around me. I felt like there were people in this bedroom that I had locked myself away in with me. I remember lying face down on my bed and feeling footprints walking on the mattress around me, even stepping on me. I felt it physically. It's a tactile hallucination as well as a visual and auditory one. There is a physicality to these hallucinations which just kind of lends them more realism. It adds credibility. I was repeatedly tapped on the shoulder to get my attention. When I closed my eyes, someone would run their fingertips down my face or tug on my beard or tug on my hair, and once I was bitten on the ear so convincingly that I got up from the bed to go and check in the mirror whether I was bleeding or not. If I reacted to any of these sensations, if I reacted to the tactile hallucination, I would hear laughter, as if it was teasing me. And the whispering was in like a kind of surround sound, so it would move from one ear to the other as if someone was walking behind me and whispering, and I would snap my head around to see who was there, and I would catch a glimpse of something like a flicker of light or a wisp of smoke, and then it would be gone. And sometimes the whispering, I felt like I could locate it. It seemed to be coming occasionally from different rooms. At that stage, I couldn't see who was doing the whispering. I would later. But at this stage, I didn't know where it was coming from. And at one point, I got up to investigate where this kind of muttering sound was coming from. Up to that point, I'd been hiding under my bedsheets with my laptop in front of me turned up really, really loud to try to drown out this whispering. But it was too persistent to ignore. In the end, it was full conversations, and I got up to go and investigate to see if I could find a source, and then maybe address it, maybe stop it. So I got out of the bed, and I walked out of my bedroom and looked down the stairs. And at the bottom, between my office on the left and my kitchen on the right, there was a short hallway at the bottom of the stairs. Standing there was a young couple, a young man and a young woman, strangers in my house. I remember them so clearly that I could still, to this day, 4 years later, pick them out of a lineup if I saw them. They were early 20s, dressed in what we in the UK used to call shell suits. They were purple and white and aqua, like cheap athletic wear. But otherwise pretty normal. In fact, I live in Berlin now, and if I saw them on the street, I wouldn't think anything of it. They were not particularly unusual. And I remember for some reason she was wearing white trainers and had Velcro fasteners instead of laces. I'm not sure why my subconscious deemed it necessary to include that little detail, but I remember it, so I include it. They were both platinum blonde with incredibly pale ivory skin, bone white. They were quite beautiful, I think. But there was something unsettlingly non-human about them, about their stillness, about their silence. They were facing each other, but as I stood at the top of the stairs, they both turned to face me. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down, and they were both staring blankly straight back at me. I remember that they were dead silent, not a motion, not a sound, and I had the strangest sense that they were hungry. They looked sad. They looked like they too were withdrawing from something. They were gaunt, they were slender. The skin seemed to be stretched tight over their sharp cheekbones. They looked malnourished, and to me, a little bit vulnerable. But despite a fleeting, passing moment of pity that I felt for them, the overriding sensation I had was one of paralyzing fear. Abject, complete, profound terror. For a moment, I was frozen to the spot. It felt like sleep apnea, like sleep paralysis. If you've ever had that sensation where you can't wake up and you feel like you can't breathe, you freeze, like you try to squeeze out a breath and you can't do it. That's how I felt in that moment. Like my heart wouldn't even beat, like my chest couldn't expand to allow me a grasp of breath. I tried to talk, to say something, but it jammed in my throat like I was choking. After a few seconds, I managed to say, "Who the fuck are you? What are you doing here?" And as my voice returned and my sense of assertiveness began to restore itself, I started walking down the stairs towards them, trembling, but trying to make myself look imposing, fighting the sense of terror and eventually shouting as I took more and more steps, getting closer and closer, "Get the fuck out, now!" I said it over and over again with each step down the steps as I approached them. And as I got close enough to see the freckles on their cheeks, they moved away around a corner, and by the time I got to the bottom of the stairs and rounded the corner into my kitchen, they were gone. I remember noting at the time that I didn't hear the front door open or close. So for a while, I stayed in the house looking around to see if they were still there somewhere. But they weren't. They were gone. Except they weren't really gone, because they were never really there. And that, I think, was the first major visual hallucination that I had. I think. There may have been more leading up to that. When I listen to other people discuss their experiences, they tend to start slower. Mine went from whispers straight to full, realizable visual hallucinations. So there may have been some that I forget. There's also a chance that I'd had one months earlier when I'd been forced to sober up for a flight out of Azerbaijan. And I remember that flight being so turbulent that the other passengers on the aeroplane were praying loudly to Allah in the expectation of their own death. And I believed that to be true for a long time. Even when I stepped off the plane, the first people that I met, my sister and her husband, I told them about that. I now believe that that may have been a hallucination too. My first experience of it may have been weeks and months before. I just don't know. But I do know those two people in my house, it was so mundane, it was so realistic, that it didn't occur to me to even consider it could be a hallucination. I didn't have any reason to believe it wasn't real. They weren't flying around, they weren't demonic creatures, they weren't hideously, they were believable people. They were convincingly real. It was all very normal. It was all quite tame. That would change. In fact, later that night, the power in my house went out. I lost my electricity, leaving me in the thick darkness in a remote Cornish fishing village, alone to deal with these hallucinations and these visualizations. So I went to the local pub, which was still open, to charge up my phone to give me enough energy, enough electricity for the evening. And even then, I told the barman that there had been people, strangers, in my house. So convinced was I that it was real. It wasn't. And I think he knew that it wasn't. Something about my overall demeanour, I think, made him suspicious that I was not well. I wish he'd told me, because I had no idea. With no electricity and no internet to distract myself, I lay under my covers in bed. I pulled them up, trying to ignore the sound of people walking around me, walking on the bed, talking to each other about me right outside my peripheral vision. Literally standing on me, I could feel it. I tried to read a book by torchlight, that's all I had left. But the book's pages started pouring out with smoke, thick volumes and billowing smoke emerging from this book between my hands, and it burst into flames, causing me to, in a moment of absolute panic, sprint to the bathroom, grab a bucket of water and throw it all over my bed. I repeatedly saw grotesque animals crawling around the bedroom, crawling around the floor. Snakes mostly, or something like snakes. They weren't real animals. They were kind of grotesque variations on real animals. Never anything larger than a dog, usually lizards, particularly snakes. Always snakes, in fact, always in the periphery of my vision, just wriggling, a writhing mass. Always just outside, just on the edges of my view. And when I looked, they would scatter and disappear. That night, I slept on the floor in every different room of my house, having been frightened out of each one at some point during that first night by things crawling, by things moving, by the floor being covered in insects and snakes. But really, that was nothing compared to what would come later. By the time this was over, I would beg for the hallucinations to just be snakes, because the hallucinations would quickly take on a very dark and psychological turn. The one thing that stays with me, perhaps more than most, is a bat that I saw. Initially lying on my bed, face down, trying to block out everything around me. I heard scratching, and I could feel it. I could feel the bed moving. There was scratching coming from underneath the bed. And because the bed was moving, I felt like this time I should investigate, just to be sure that there was nothing there. When I had summoned up the courage to look under the bed, to put my head over the edge of the bed and look down, a huge bat emerged, flashed right in front of my face so that I could feel the air move, and then scurried up the wall diagonally. I ran straight out of the bedroom, slammed the door behind me. Eventually, after a couple of hours, I gathered some strength, gathered my fortitude, whatever I had left, and I picked up a hand towel and I fished a polystyrene box out of the bin, a fast food container that I'd bought a kebab or a cheeseburger or something and then discarded. And slowly and cautiously, still petrified with fear, I opened the door and I could still see the bat flittering around on the opposite wall. And I went to catch it. And eventually I managed to kind of shepherd it into this polystyrene food container that I was holding. And I squeezed it shut, and I wrapped the hand towel around the box, put the box and the towel into a plastic carrier bag, and then double knotted the top of the bag. I took the bag downstairs, opened my front door, and I left it there. When this was all over, once in about 5 days, the hallucinations had begun to recede. I thought it would be a good test to go and see if that bat was real or not, if it was still in that food container outside my front door. So I went down, and outside I untied the bag, which was still there, untouched, and very carefully and with fear I pulled back the towel to see if the bat was still within the food container. I didn't know what I was going to see. I wouldn't have liked it either way. If it was there, it would be a relief in the sense that I hadn't hallucinated it, but then I'd be dealing with a bat on my front door. It's scarier to consider, though, that it wasn't there, and I had hallucinated it, which of course was the case. I pulled back the towel. Not only was there no bat, there was no food container. I had hallucinated not just the bat, but also the container in which I had put it. It was very confusing. And it continued like that for 5 days. It got worse. For 5 days, I continued to experience unbelievably vivid auditory, visual, and tactile hallucinations. Everything in that period that I experienced was absolutely horrific. Sometimes the hallucinations were violent, gory, threatening, always a sense of menace. Sometimes they were sexual, and all of them were drawn from my deepest insecurities, the kinds of insecurities that you don't tell anybody about. But my subconscious knew, and it knew how to use those fears against me. I'll give you an example. I see faces when I hallucinate. Always faces. In fact, for me, in that particular period, it's a very specific kind of face called les gueules cassées, the destroyed faces. It's a French term applied to soldiers of the First World War who had suffered horrific facial injuries. The French soldiers were particularly susceptible to this, and after the war they used to put these people together in communes, so badly disfigured were they that they required specialised hospitals. After all, in trench warfare, the trenches that they dug in the First World War provided some measure of protection for your body, but very little for your face and head. Many injuries incurred in the First World War are from the neck up. The air was full of flying metal, shrapnel, bullets, debris, which meant that a lot of the survivable injuries that people suffered were to their face. By peeking over the top of a trench could quite easily mean a face full of metal, hot metal, tearing away features. This group, les gueules cassées, would often be missing their entire lower jaws, both eyes or one eye. The entire centre of their faces would be torn off, noses missing. No amount of surgery would fix it. They were stuck with these horrific injuries for their entire lives, for as long as the injury would permit them to live. And those are the faces that I saw repeatedly, consistently. Initially, those faces would be staring at me from outside windows. In fact, sometimes I would hallucinate the window too. So the terrifying disfigured faces that were staring at me would be staring from a window that itself didn't exist. I knew where the windows in my house were, and occasionally I would glance at a bare wall and I would see a big open window with a line of these badly injured and disfigured faces staring bleakly in at me, accusingly. Then they began to appear in shadows in the room itself, in the corners of the room, or worse, in the bed with me, staring at me pleadingly and beggingly. At one point, I poked my head out of the sheets, I think when the sun rose. One of the mornings, I forget which, it all kind of merged into one by this point. And to my terror and surprise, I saw the decapitated head of a policeman on my bedside table. He'd clearly been dead for some time, And for some reason I had the intrinsic, unshakable knowledge that I had murdered this policeman and kept his head as a trophy on my bedside table, and that the other police knew and were coming for me. Police are also a common characteristic of my hallucinations. In part, I think, because of the various violence and trauma done to me by police forces around the world, namely in Xinjiang in China, where I would commonly have police pull shotguns or raid my hotel rooms, stop me mob-handed in the streets, lots of guns in my face in China, and then even worse in Kazakhstan, where I was robbed at gunpoint twice by officers in uniform. And in fact, those faces, those badly disfigured faces, they don't disappear when I close my eyes. In fact, I see them more vividly. Insomnia is another symptom of withdrawal, but when it gets into the stage of delirium tremens, that insomnia, there is no sleep. And I remember trying very hard to get some, knowing that it was necessary, knowing that I had to sleep for the sake of my health. I really tried. And in those kind of liminal moments between sleep and wakefulness, the hallucinations became something really different, something very interesting. For example, I hallucinated a whole hours-long story, coherent and internally consistent, with story arcs and character development. There were different characters and they were named. And the whole story, everything rhymed perfectly. Every single line, every piece of dialogue within this hallucination perfectly rhymed, like a world-class musical. I hallucinated an entire musical, and it was a good one. It was an interesting one. It seemed to be something about a very deep and very private insecurity I have about my own fertility. The details of a hallucination like this, that's not a hallucination but also not a dream, the details tend to get fuzzy after a while, so I don't remember it absolutely perfectly. I wish I could, because I think there is a novel in it. But here's what I do remember. I remember walking through this hallucination and encountering quite a wide river. And in the river, there were a group of women sat naked with their legs open, facing upstream with the frothy water flowing over their naked bodies, and they were rubbing the froth from the river all over themselves. And then, forgive me for being graphic, but I walked a little further upstream, where I found another group, this time of men, and they were ejaculating into the river. Then it was flowing down to these women who were presumably trying to get pregnant. It was very strange. The whole hallucination was about a highly... This is where it gets interesting, because when I said it was internally consistent, all of this had kind of narrative significance behind it. So the hallucination was about a highly stratified society in which reproductive rates had fallen to the point of societal collapse. And these villages that I'd hallucinated were turning to all sorts of highly ritualized fertility ceremonies, like this one in the river, to increase the birth rate. They were trying to continue the species with these bizarre fertility rites. I remember they were all chanting, and I forget the chant now. I remember at the time of making a point to remember it because it was beautiful, but unfortunately it's faded over time. But it was beautiful and it rhymed perfectly, and when it was over, I remember thinking that I had no idea that my brain, my stupid brain, which I don't use normally, had the power, the capability to generate this level of creativity in real time. But then it turned very dark. It turned very violent. I remember walking past another group of young men who had been deemed infertile by this society, which was a crime as far as their laws were concerned, since they were infertile but taking up resources that could have otherwise gone to fertile couples, and they were therefore considered useless mouths, a phrase that might be familiar to those of you who study military history. And these young men who had committed the crime of being infertile were being executed by being tied high up onto wooden posts above the ground, and then the posts were pushed down and they were falling face first into bear traps. It was vicious and violent and gory, and what does that say about my mind? And I should stress, while I say that I was trying to sleep when this happened, I can't guarantee that. In fact, I don't really know where I was when that particular hallucination was happening. I might have been lying in bed, and this was all just playing out in my mind, but I fear it's equally possible that I was outside, walking around, interacting with real people. My hallucination taking real perceptual data and subverting it into this weird conceptual narrative. It's very possible I was having that hallucination in public. I don't know. And that's a scary thought too. I don't know, but I do know this. Once you've had hallucinations that convincing, that persuasive, that powerful, you never fully trust your perception ever again. Even now, if I see a flicker in the corner of my eye, I get a little rush of adrenaline in case it's the start of a new hallucination. And I still have to cross-check with what I'm seeing or hearing against what I know to be real to make sure that I'm not hallucinating, even now in complete sobriety. You never trust your senses again. There are so many other hallucinations that I would like to tell you about from other experiences with Delirium Tremens. We don't have time here to go into all of them, but I'll give you some more highlights just to give you a flavour of what it's like. So in one of them, a later hallucination, I was stood in the corner of my bedroom. It was quite a big room, and I was looking at a long overcoat hanging up on the back of the bedroom door in the opposite corner some distance away. In the darkness, a face emerged, peeking out of the corner of that overcoat hanging up on the door, staring at me. It was a woman with knotted, wet black hair and dead eyes just staring back at me. I was once again just frozen with terror, and I watched her slither down like a liquid from that overcoat down into a puddle, a black puddle of oil on the floor under the door, and then it rose up. She rose up from it, and she stood up, taller than me, in a long wedding dress that looked like it had been underwater for months. It was kind of grey and mouldy, and it stank. I could smell it. She stood for a moment perfectly still, staring at each other, and then she swooned backwards, and then suddenly rushed towards me. And as she got close, she drew her hand back, as if in a punch, and as she approached, she got closer, she threw the punch straight into the centre of my chest. She punched clean through my sternum and gripped my heart in my chest. She squeezed it and began pumping it while she got closer and closer, staring into my eyes, so close I could smell the death on her breath. I could feel it. I could feel all of it physically. When she ran into me, the force of it pushed me back against the wall. I could feel her hand inside my body. I could feel her bony fingers around my heart. I could feel it all. In the end, I physically fought her off. But that happened. That felt real to me in every possible sense. I could see her. I could smell her. I could hear her. And I could feel her. I think in that moment, I was genuinely close to a real heart attack. I remember being in a doctor's surgery, waiting to see my doctor once while I was going through the early stages of another withdrawal. I remember being in the waiting room, and it was really busy that day. There seemed to be lots of people. It was very crowded and very noisy. I became aware that people were talking about me. There were two women playing with their children. I remember them saying to each other very loudly, loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. I remember them saying that I belonged in prison. And then more and more people in the waiting room were getting involved in that conversation, shouting across the room about me, as though I weren't even there, having discussions across the room about what a terrible person I was. And when I went into the doctor, I said to him, I remember saying, "Your waiting room's very hostile. Everyone seems very angry. Is there something wrong?" And he looked at me a bit confused, and he picked up the phone, made a phone call to the receptionist, and he asked her if everything was okay out in the waiting room. And then he set down the phone, And he said to me, "There's no one in the waiting room." Ice cold chill down my spine when I realised that I was hallucinating again. And then there was a more recent one, a sustained, coherent delusion more than a hallucination this time, in which I believed that my girlfriend was trying to extort money from me to pay human traffickers who had kidnapped her. I was so convinced that that was true, and it made so much logical sense in my delusional mind that I even went to the police station and filed a report. And the police would come to my apartment a couple of days later to check that she was actually okay. But that particular delusion went on for several days. And then there was the worst hallucination of them all. One that still makes me scared to even talk about it, so vivid was this experience. This one happened at my parents' house while I was staying for some recovery. So at some point while I was cycling for real, in real life, across Kazakhstan, I happened to be the first on the scene for a very nasty car accident. 2 cars involved. Everybody was injured. But one was injured in particular, a young woman in the back seat of one of the cars. Her head had gone through the window, and her scalp had been torn open to the bone and I think beyond. It was bad. Blood everywhere. And I was unable to help in any meaningful way. The day before, I'd been robbed, and one of the things that had been robbed was my first aid kit. So I found myself cradling this young woman's head, trying to hold her head together, trying to keep as much blood in her body as possible, with nothing more than some baby wipes that I'd bought earlier in the day. I was holding her head together, thick black blood rolling over my fingers, watching the life slip from her eyes. And then in the hallucination a year later, that same woman with that same awful head wound appeared in my bed next to me, accusing me of murdering her. I fled the bed in just abject panic, and I remember banging on my parents' bedroom door, and I confessed to them that the dead woman in my bed I had killed, but it had been an accident. And my dad, who knew I was hallucinating, didn't have the courtesy to tell me I was hallucinating, went into the bedroom and he said, "Stu, look." And that's my name, by the way, Stu, hello. And he pulled back the sheets on my bed and there was no one there. And I saw that it was hallucination and I fell to the floor in tears. Tears of relief, I think. I'd also briefly been in jail in Kazakhstan for something completely unrelated. But in a hallucination at that same period of withdrawal, I had escaped my parents' house and was trying to scale a wall in their garden until my dad came out with a torch to bring me back in. But in my hallucination, the house was a jail and the wall I was climbing over was a prison wall, and the torch that my dad was holding was a searchlight from a guard tower, and my father was wearing a full military uniform. In my mind, he'd been sent by the British Embassy in disguise as one of the prison commandants to sneak me out or something. It made sense in my head at the time. It had these hallucinations, as crazy as they were, sometimes they had an internal logic that made them very difficult to break out of because they were internally consistent. I could go on and on for hours. In fact, I quite want to. There's something in me that wants to document everything, but there's so much of it. These hallucinations, they move in dream time. So for every minute I have of hallucination time, I have an hour's worth of memory from it. But right now, I want to talk about fear. There is a completely unique, unparalleled kind of fear that is distinct to delirium tremens and alcoholic hallucinosis. It's a different kind of fear. In fact, the people who die in delirium tremens, and as I mentioned, that's about 40% of people who experience it without treatment, they generally die of strokes and heart attacks. Even heroin withdrawal won't kill you. It might make you feel like you're about to die, and you might feel like you want to die for about 2 weeks, but heroin withdrawal won't kill you. Alcohol withdrawal will. And I'm not sure if those strokes and heart attacks are purely physiological as a direct result of the biochemical processes of withdrawal, or as the result of the fear that these hallucinations provoke. If you told me that the majority of people who die from delirium tremens die of fear, I would have no trouble believing it. And that's because the fear that you experience as part of these hallucinations is not separate from the hallucination. They're not the result of the hallucination. They are part of the hallucination. They are baked in, built in to the visualizations. In fact, for me, in my experience, the fear actually comes before the hallucination. The rising fear, for me, is a warning sign that an hallucination is about to begin. Now, I've been to the acute withdrawal party several times now. Stupidly. But one benefit is that I've learned to recognize the symptoms and the warning signs and the triggers that a hallucination is about to occur, and as such, the last time it happened, we were prepared for it. My girlfriend and I packed a bag ready for the hospital in anticipation that if I was about to start seeing things or hearing things, straight to the hospital. So I've learned to spot when it's going to happen. It starts with a physical sensation. It's a rush of ice-cold prickles, usually up the back of my legs and along my sides. And then a pang of absolute, abject, exhausting, paralyzing panic, a feeling of dread, impending death. I get huge goosebumps out of nowhere, and I sweat. And then, once all of those symptoms have presented themselves, the cold, the goosebumps, the sweating, the fear, then I will see a face, maybe in a pile of clothes, or hiding in a pot plant, or in a cupboard or something. Somewhere I will start to register faces, usually disfigured, as I discussed. That's the start. That's the start of the hallucination, and that's when it's time to call an ambulance. The fear, though, it's not like anything I've experienced outside of hallucination. I've had guns in my face. I've been close to drowning. I've had bad drug trips. I know fear. I've been in situations where I've known I was about to die. I have known fear, and this is nothing like that. This is paralyzing, incapacitating terror. The kind of terror that can drive you insane. I remember crying hysterically at moments, just wanting the fear to stop. I remember screaming, blood-curdling shrieks into the blackness of the night. You can't open your eyes because of the fear of what you will see, and you can't close your eyes because of the fear of what you can't see. It's torture, and you have no control. So, that was heavy, wasn't it? That's something like an account of what delirium tremens and alcoholic hallucinosis is like to experience, rather than just read about in a bullet point list on some recovery website. As I said earlier, there aren't many people talking about this, but those that do report strikingly similar visualizations. That is to say, my account may well be very similar to another account that you might go away and listen to. In fact, there are characters that are common to a lot of these hallucinations, and I saw them too. The woman in the white dress that I just described, who put her hand in my chest, she seems to be relatively common across these hallucinations. So is what's occasionally called Top Hat Man, which is a tall, dark, terrifying figure just standing somewhere in the room with you with some kind of tall hat. I saw him too, repeatedly. To me, he looked kind of like an ink blot, like a sketch of a person. His outline was not very well defined. It kept changing shape, a little bit like ink in water. And I remember him standing at the foot of my bed watching me. and I managed to squeeze out some words. I'm pretty sure that I was really saying this. I tried to talk to him. I asked him who he was. I asked him if I was safe. And I got no reply. He just stood silently, and that's my experience of Top Hat Man. I've since seen him multiple times. A lot of other people have too. And if I haven't made it clear by now, these hallucinations and the fear that goes with them, they're some of the most disturbing experiences any reasonable human can experience. They are terrible, haunting, traumatic. They show you things about yourself that you don't want to see. They tell you things that you don't want to hear. They are designed to hurt you. There isn't really language. The words don't exist to convey how terrifying an experience this is. I sympathise with everybody who's gone with it, and I also tend to be able to spot somebody who's gone through it too. In recovery rooms, when someone says they've experienced delirium tremens, well, we tend to gravitate towards each other because people who haven't experienced it simply cannot have any comprehension of what it's like. In fact, even now, talking about it to you is difficult to do because recalling it is partially reliving it, and I would do anything not to relive any of those experiences ever again. I hope this has been of some use to somebody out there. It has been to me, so I guess that's a positive. If you are watching this because you suspect you might be going through it, pick up the phone and get an ambulance right now. Fuck the insurance, fuck whatever it costs. This stuff is serious. You need to take it seriously because for thousands of people every year, it's not just hallucinations, it is life or death. See you next time.